Hello. Thank you for meeting with us today. Would you be able to briefly introduce yourself and describe the work that you do?
Okay, sure. My name is Ram Neta. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. My specialty is epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and evidence and
Hmm.
how we're supposed to form our beliefs in response to our evidence. And thanks for having me today.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, what sort of specific things do you look at that fall under the category of epistemology?
There are all sorts of issues that I'm thinking about right now, but I guess they could be summed up under the following umbrella. Um, why be rational? So we ordinarily think of rationality as a kind of compliment that we pay to people, right? Someone's highly rational, and not just a compliment that we can pay, but also a description of an aspiration,
Hmm.
right? We might try to be rational. Try to think about this rationally for a moment.
Yeah.
But what makes the aspiration worthwhile, and what makes the description a compliment? So that's a way of summing up what I think I'm fundamentally interested in is the value of rationality.
Hmm. Well, so actually, that's kind of interesting that you bring that up because I've actually wanted to ask somebody who's an expert in this field if they think that ants could be considered rational, like,
We'll see.
in particular between the individual ant and then versus the ant colony, for example.
Okay, it's interesting that you ask that because I have a question about the contrast between the individual ant and the ant colony.
Yeah, sure.
And this question betrays, I think, how little I know about the biology of ants and their group structure. But I want to understand, why is it that we think of individual ants as organisms rather than thinking of the colony as an organism with a bunch of moving parts?
Right. Yeah. That's actually kind of an interesting question because that's actually something even within the field of myrmecology, people who study ants, that is a little bit debated because there's the concept of the superorganism, which is basically that idea, I think. But
actually, I mean, it's not that I want to ask whether ant colonies are superorganisms, right? Someone could ask whether a political organization like a nation state or a city is a superorganism, right? Because it has all these different parts that work together, kind of like the different parts of an organism all work together. But I have a slightly different question, which is, why think of the ant colony as a superorganism and the ant as an organism rather than just thinking of the ant colony as an organism? In other words, what is it about ant colonies that makes them not organisms like you or me?
Right,
I mean, their parts are, their parts are spatially distinct, but that they still move in tandem.
I mean, it might be that very element that it just that they happen to be physically distinct and are brought into the world individually, and then sort of come to be this cohesive unit, but. I mean, I do admit that, like ecologically, they essentially do function. Like a colony basically is an organism. Yeah.
But isn't that also true of ourselves?
I guess it's true at a micro scale. Yeah. No, that's true.
Scale, our cells come to be individually, and they die off individually.
Yeah, that's true.
They move to some extent independently of each other. I mean, there are causal relations between the way some cells move and the way other cells move. But there are also causal relations between the way individual ants move.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, why not think of the individual ants as cells of a single organism, which is the ant colony?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that question.
I think the answer is actually that it actually makes sense to, and that so like there are I think people who do, like, even when they refer to the superorganism, it basically is just the idea that, like, effectively the colony is an organism, and so it's it doesn't really make sense to consider it evolutionarily or ecologically as these, like, separate things. Yeah.
Well, the reason I asked that question, the reason it's related to the question of rationality is because I want to know whose rationality are we talking about?
Right.
That of the individual ant or that of the ant colony? And because they do behave differently. I mean, I can say why, so far as I understand individual ants, I'd be inclined to say that they're not rational.
How come?
Let me modify that statement.
Okay,
I just realized in saying they're not rational, there are two different ways that you can hear that claim. So I said earlier that rationality was a certain kind of compliment. We might compliment someone by describing them as rational.
Right.
But rationality can also be used not just to describe not just to describe someone who has a very high degree of certain capacity, right? They can exercise their capacity to reason to a very high degree. Rationality can also be used to describe someone who has that capacity to any degree. So when Aristotle said humans are rational animals, he didn't mean that we're all very highly rational. He just meant we all have this capacity to reason.
I see. Look, basically, like it's like on the spectrum or something of rationality.
We're sort of on the spectrum of rationality, right? And now, in ordinary parlance, when we describe someone as rational and we treat that as a compliment, we're saying they occupy a very high point on that spectrum. Right? They're sort of, relative to the rest of us, they're much more rational or something like that.
Yeah.
But if the question is whether ants are rational, well, you don't mean are they rational enough for us to compliment them on their rationality? Are they more rational than we? Well, I suppose you might have meant that also. Right?
Well, when you're talking about ants, I'm assuming anything related to an ant is a compliment. So, I don't think you have to worry about that.
I see. So I was thinking. I was thinking what you were asking about was not do they have the capacity to reason to a very high degree, or do they exercise that capacity to a very high degree? I assume what you were asking about was do they have that capacity at all?
Right. Yeah. Right? And I guess I would put it at like maybe more than, let's say, like your average insect, like a beetle that's not engaging in the social behavior, maybe, or something like that. Or do you think it's closer to humans than people would expect, or anything like that?
So I don't think it's closer to humans than other. Or let me put it this way, right? Because I don't. What I know about ants is that they have more complicated forms of social organization than other insects. But
most other insects, yeah.
I don't know much. Yeah. So if the question is just, does the complexity of their social organization provide evidence of their rationality?
Yeah, that would be yeah.
Right. I think the answer is no.
Okay.
Unless that complexity assumes a certain form, and I don't know if it does. So let me say why. So think about. Did you ever see the Charlie Chaplin movie Modern Times?
No, actually.
All right. So there's the movie starts off with a picture of humans in a factory, and you have these men who are all moving in a single direction into the gates of the factory in the morning, who all assume their position in the factory, and then each one of them does some tiny little task in along an assembly line that's mass producing some commodity, and we never find out what that commodity is, right? Yeah. So Charlie Chaplin's job is to take these two wrenches and tighten bolts as they go by, right? As they go by him on the assembly line. So he walks into the factory, and then he does this all day, and then he walks out. And it paints a very dehumanizing picture of modern factory work. Now, that's a complex form of interaction among a bunch of different organisms, right? Each one of them is, they're all moving together at a certain time, and they're all assigned their task in a collective mission.
Yeah.
All supposed to perform that task, and actually, to the extent that each one of them has their own individual needs or thoughts, or they want to take a smoke break, or they want to go and read something, think about something else. To that extent, the boss cracks the whip on them and says, "Hey, get back to work."
Right.
So there's a complex social organization, but a creature's participation in that social organization doesn't constitute their rationality. In fact, if anything, their participation in that social organization is a kind of absence of rationality.
Yeah.
Right? They're just supposed to go in and serve as a cog in this
right.
social machine.
Actually, so I'm wondering but then we also established that maybe the colony could be considered the organism. Or I think what's interesting is that actually colony decision making, for example, when they go to forage for food, actually has a certain sort of like it seems to be assessing the world in some sense and actually finding the correct food source first. It's a kind of random process, but it is sort of done in a way that ends up leading the colony to forage, for example, for food that's closer first and then farther away, that sort of thing.
That's right, and that's why I asked you if we are talking about what's the organism here.
Oh, right. So if it was the individual ant, you would say certainly no, and then
if it's the individual ant, I think, to the extent that I understand how individual ants live in tandem,
right.
I think no, that thing isn't rational. That thing is just functional.
Right.
Right. But to the extent that it's the ant colony, I think, the ant colony might be, the capacity to reason.
Yeah.
Right. It might be something with the capacity to set goals for itself and to pursue those goals more or less effectively in light of the information it gets.
Right. Yeah.
Individual ant, I think. Again, to the extent that I understand how individual ants.
Right. Of course. Yeah.
The individual ant is not setting goals for itself, is not trying to figure out how best to pursue those goals in light of the information it gets. The individual ant is just
barreling along.
Doing its job in a more or less mechanical, routine fashion, and it's the ant colony that is more plausibly thought of as a decision maker here.
And I guess even the ant colony, even though of course I would love to think of them as as more rational than the average insect conglomerate or whatever, it still is the case probably that maybe in a really strict sense of rationality, because you were using the term of setting a goal for itself and stuff, because it is the ant colony does sort of move in a more it's sort of like a emergent kind of order or emergent decision making, where there isn't really, at least doesn't seem to be too much evidence for kind of self-directed or really processing in the sense that we might think of it for, I guess, true rationality or something. But at least it's interesting to hear you think that maybe it's potentially more rational than at least the individual.
But with when you talk about true rationality, I'm reminded of there was a documentary by Errol Morris called "Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control,"
I may have heard of it.
It's a documentary that's partly about the robotics lab at MIT. And one of the things he does is look at the effort, the early effort to build robots. And what pioneers in robotics discovered was that, the early efforts to build robots, they all had a central command unit. There were the moving parts, but then there was some unit inside that took in the information, processed the information somehow, and generated commands to the various moving parts.
Yeah.
And it turned out that on that model, it's almost impossible to build any kind of serious robot. If you want to build a robot that does anything like what a human being does, you actually have to distribute the command.
Oh, interesting.
So think of it this way. If true rationality is what we're accustomed to seeing from the human beings that we think of as rational, if that's what true rationality is, then true rationality is not like a planned economy. It's like a market economy where the decision-making is distributed across a bunch of different units.
Interesting.
There's no sort of central planner.
So then, like in that way, like ant colonies or ant species are sort of almost like pre-adapted or whatever for potentially having a sort of rational or even truly rational kind of framework or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. That's why once again, that's why I think it's not the individual ant that could plausibly be thought of as rational.
Yeah.
But the ant colony might be rational.
Huh. Yeah.
But now, again, I don't know enough about how ant colonies work. In ant colonies, is there a central planner?
There actually is not, generally. That's actually one of the interesting things about it, like as opposed to, from what I understand, termite colonies actually have more of a somewhat of a centralization where they do this like thing called oral trophallaxis or oral anal trophallaxis, which is like mouth to mouth or mouth to anus feeding, and they actually transfer chemicals that way and like kind of communicate. And ants do that as well, but it seems like there's not as much of a of like a directional sort of communication from like the queen to like to the workers and that sort of thing. And so it does seem like it is pretty distributed from everything I've read and everything I know about the average ant colony. There are always exceptions, but.
I see. So then the question of whether the ant colony is rational becomes like the question of whether a certain kind of market economy is rational.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there are different market economies. People often, because it's the biggest market economy, people often think of American capitalism, but American capitalism isn't the only kind of capitalism. I mean, there's also Ugandan capitalism.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there are all sorts of market economies, right? But markets markets can operate more or less rationally under various circumstances.
Right? And like I guess in that context, like rationality would be considered just like kind of assessing the world and making choices or whatever in a way that like achieves some goal the best or something, right?
Right. Yeah. When I say market economies can operate more or less rational, I mean what that would amount to is market economies operating more or less efficiently.
Oh, right.
Because efficiency is what markets crave.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's what they're for. They're for efficiency.
Yeah.
And so a rational market economy is one that operates efficiently, right? Where when you have some locus of inefficiency, like a monopoly or an ossified bureaucracy or something like that, it gets eaten away at. It sort of, it dissolves.
Right.
And you have some other locus of inefficiency, like ignorance, then mechanisms are put in place to make, to remedy that.
Right, yeah. Which is kind of interesting. I mean, it actually is, as far as I can think of right now, that's pretty consistent, I think, with the way that ant colonies generally operate. Because you have various individual ants that might be, finding the worst food source or that sort of thing, and that there's sort of like quasi-random processes that lead to this sort of generally optimized decision making. And so, I mean, there's actually even like a mathematical, like the ant colony optimization algorithm is a real algorithm that's like made based on the kind of ways that ant colonies operate, roughly.
Is that right?
Yeah, and it's used. If I remember correctly, I think it's used even. I think it's been applied to like certain internet search algorithms and that sort of thing.
I see.
So I guess that kind of also goes in the favorable column for ant rationality or ant colony rationality. At least.
Okay, well then, so in light of that, I guess what I'd be inclined to say is that individual ants are probably too routine and too stupid to be.
Hey, what are you saying?
If they had the capacity to reason at all, what would they do with it?
Yeah. Right.
It's not clear why it would benefit them.
Yeah,
it's not clear why the capacity to reason would benefit them any more than it would benefit a plant.
Right. Yeah.
But ant colonies, in contrast, might have the capacity to reason, and actually, depending on how well they operate to achieve the needs of the colony, they might be pretty rational.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, that's I think that was a pretty like thorough discussion on that, and that's also like kind of interesting to think about too.
I'm glad.
Yeah, I just had like a couple other questions, maybe that are a little bit more on the silly side, perhaps. But I'm wondering, like, what have ants contributed to the field of philosophy, if anything?
Oh, I can only answer that question. Uh, I can only answer that question by pointing out a couple of phenomena that I personally noticed first in connection with ants.
Oh, interesting. Do tell.
Yeah. So one is aesthetic, and it's a version of a phenomenon that's recently been very prominently discussed by my colleague Lori Paul.
Oh yeah, right, yeah.
Talks about transformative experience, and so let me describe the aesthetic phenomenon that I have in mind. I remember as a kid, I was having a picnic with my parents. I looked down and I saw an individual ant. Then I saw another individual ant, and another. I saw several individual ants, and then I got up and looked at them from a distance, and I realized that there was actually like a parade, like they were marching in formation as ants do.
Right.
And the parade had my experience of the parade was very different in aspect from my experience of each individual ant. There was a kind of gestalt shift when I looked at them as opposed to looking at each individual ant.
Right.
And so aesthetically, I felt like there was a version of transformative experience, a kind of experience where I start off seeing, individuals and seeing them as individuals. Let's say, one following the other, and then I no longer see them as individuals. I see it as a group. I see the group as a kind of
like even though each individual thing has stayed the same. Yeah. It's just sort of your experience of it that's shifted.
My experience of it changes. It's not that, exactly. It's my experience of the things change, even though I'm experiencing the same things. And my experience of it changes in the way that it individuates the things, in the way in which I experience them first as individuals and later as parts of a single larger individual.
Right.
That changed the way I saw them.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
It also, I mean, I was that's related to a kind of change that took place in my thinking about. I don't know if you'd call this moral thinking exactly, but when I saw the individual ants, I had a really hard time. My father was just started squishing them.
Yeah, right.
And I had a hard time with that. Like it was sort of hard for me to stomach that. But then when I got up and I saw them all like parade, I found it much easier to squish them. Like that, it just it didn't feel repellent in the same way that it felt repellent when I was looking at each one individually.
Interesting. I mean, it's interesting because I actually have a fairly similar feeling. Like when I collect ants, the research I do involves like whole colonies of ants and that. And it is interesting how I feel much worse about killing or causing to be killed an entire colony of ants versus just a few of the workers, whatever. And that's even somewhat grounded, I think, in even like the actual ecological function in that like you said before, the actual, if the colony is more like the organism, then individual ants are maybe a little more just like skin cells or something.
I see. Okay.
Of course, however, they each have their own brain though. So Did you
say ants have their own brain?
Yeah, I mean, like each ant has a little brain. Yeah.
Is that true of every animal? Does every animal have a brain?
Not necessarily a brain. So, for example, even things like sponges are actually animals. So they don't all have like a brain in the sense of what we think of as a brain, like a conglomeration of like neural tissue that's processing information. Right. But I would say the vast majority of them do, or at least a large majority of them do. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
But definitely not.
All animals have to have some kind of a nervous system in order to react to their environment. But I didn't.
Yeah, in fact, there's actually people like researching like at Harvard, I believe, and a couple other places. Researching ant brains and actually my advisor Corey Moreau, part of she's on one grant that's looking at like brain morphology in ants and that sort of thing.
I see.
Yeah,
I see. I started. This is a complete tangent right now.
That's totally acceptable.
That was interesting enough for me to share. Before I had ever heard of philosophy, when I started college, I thought that I would end up being a scientist like my parents. So after my freshman year, taking science courses, I worked in a biophysics lab at NIH. And the biophysics lab was studying the mechanisms of photoexcitation of retinal rod cells in frogs. And one of my jobs in the lab was we would get these shipments of live frogs, and I would take the frog, I would cut its brain out of its head with a pair of blunt scissors. I was basically supposed to cut, to get the brain
right
out of the skull, put the brain inside some nutrient fluid to keep it operating.
Right.
Study it.
Wow.
And then, while the brain was still alive, we were supposed to perform experiments on it so that we could study the mechanisms of photoexcitation,
That seems a little tough morally, I mean.
Sort of chemical exchanges across the neural membrane.
Right.
And I remember hearing someone talk to me once about brains and vats. Brains and vats. And so they gave me a book about this. And I just thought, wow, that's so much more interesting than anything about frogs.
Yeah.
And that's how I went from being an amateur scientist or an apprentice scientist to being an epistemologist.
So you're saying that philosophers are just brains and vats, basically. That's kind of
Well, a lot of people who were interested in the part of philosophy that I am got interested in it by thinking about brains and vats. But
so actually, that was actually one other question I also wanted to ask was actually if you could learn one thing about ants, what would it be? One thing you don't already know about ants. Maybe it's a little hard question.
Hang on a second. Hang on. I'd want to understand. I mean, I'm interested in the questions about rationality that you raised at the beginning. I'm professionally interested in questions about that. I would want to understand more about whether there's any scope in the life of an individual ant for decision making.
Yeah.
What is there ever a point at which anything that an individual ant does could be? Is there any point at which anything that an individual ant does could constitute a decision, as opposed to a reaction?
I think it's possible. For example, there was a really cool study shown about some like desert ants, Cataglyphus, that they did these experiments where they adjusted the length of the legs by adding stilts or by cutting off the legs a little bit. It's thought that ants don't feel pain, so it didn't affect their behavior, but any noticeable way. But anyways, and they actually detected it through the research that they were pretty convincingly showed that the ant workers are actually counting the steps that they go back, and so when they go to a food source and they go back to the colony, if you adjust the length of the legs when they're away, they will overstep or undershoot the colony by a certain number of steps. So they have some sort of pedometer. However, we have pedometer. But however, it's possible that still is fundamentally reactive in the way that every other kind of most ant decisions are. It still might just be sort of like it might have some sort of just like it's not really thinking about it or really processing it. It's just sort of like reacting after it moves a certain number of steps. But that's a little bit of a blurred line to me, actually, where decision and reaction
differ.
Yeah.
Well, here's what I can. So so it's an interesting philosophical question, I think, where decision differs from reaction.
Yeah.
But I can give you a test for when you have decision as opposed to reaction.
Huh.
Is there ever a point where the creature does something that amounts to saying, I'm sick of this shit? Now, if there's ever a point when the creature does that, then I think the creature is capable of making a decision.
That's interesting.
That's a test. That's not a criterion, but it's a test.
Yeah. That's a. Oh, well, right. So I guess you mean that like it's something could still be rational and not necessarily like do that or whatever. It could still be rational, but it's like a test. Yeah, right. But that's interesting. I mean, there's actually studies on things like basically ant laziness or. But really what that is looking at the variation activity of ants. It still isn't quite. Yeah, like as far as I know, there's no clear case of that sort of thing. There are some cases of ants where they don't have a strict queen worker structure, and some of the workers might have functional or partially functional ovaries, and sometimes there is sort of like what is almost considered like deviant behavior where they might start laying eggs or like try to lay eggs or that sort of thing.
Is the queen the only one who can reproduce?
Generally, yeah, that's the general rule, but there are some exceptions.
I see, okay.
Yeah, I mean there actually are some colonies with like no males, for example, but the general rule is that the queen is the reproducing one.
If the colony has no males, I don't know enough about ant reproduction. Can the queen reproduce without males?
So actually, yeah, because so there's a system called haplodiploidy where where males have, humans have double chromosomes. So you have two sets. So in ants, males, the actual sex determination system is by number of chromosome per set. So if you have half the set, or like really it's like only one copy of each chromosome, then you're male, and if you have two, you're female. So unfertilized eggs become males, and so in those colonies where workers lay eggs, usually they're unmated, and so they'll lay a bunch of males, and so the genes still pass the next generation, but it's not really like a full production of females and males. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you had a colony, no, wait a second. If you had a colony with no males, then none of the eggs would be fertilized, and so all of the eggs would turn into males. Isn't that right?
Well, so actually what happens is before a queen makes a colony, she actually gets mated before prior to, yeah. So it's like, but sorry, it was a little bit confusing when I said. I think the ones there's some species they actually have no males at all, and they reproduce by parthenogenesis, where the egg just like doubles automatically and then can become basically essentially fertilized.
I see.
I
see. Okay.
Yeah, we're right. But we can either automatically doubles. And actually, there are some other animals, like certain like lizards, that do that and stuff. And so like that's just kind of a unique thing. But in most ants, yeah, if the queen is not fertilized, or which doesn't really happen, but if the workers start laying eggs and they're not fertilized, then they become male.
Can you imagine how different human life would be if you produced that way?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I mean, like males only live to be about a day, so it wouldn't be very good for us, I suppose. But but yeah, it would be pretty. It'd be pretty crazy.
I mean, all our institutions would fall apart,
or just be different.
Or yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, well, I think I asked most questions. I did have a couple questions about. Well, I mean, I guess I just really briefly. I think it's interesting. The Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi said that the true saint leaves wisdom to the ants, takes cues from the fishes, and leaves willfulness to the sheep. What do you think about that?
I'm sorry. Who said this?
Zhuangzi, the Chinese philosopher.
I see. The true saint who leaves wisdom to the ants.
Yeah. Takes cues from the fishes and leaves willfulness to the sheep.
Wow. I wonder what it takes. Leaves wisdom to the ants, takes cues from the fishes, and leaves willfulness to the sheep. Wow.
Yeah, I kind of don't really know exactly what it means either, but I like it.
The idea is so that the sheep would become willful as opposed to compliant.
I wonder if that's what that means, right? It's like allow them to become these things or something? Or
something like takes cues from the ant. So something like does his job. Or no, takes cues from the fishes.
Right, it's wisdom from the ants. Yeah.
Yeah. gives wisdom. Right. Okay. Yes. Because the sheep are compliant and the ants are stupid.
Ostensibly.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Ants are stupid. The individual ants are stupid. They're just sort of, functionaries.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting, actually.
Yeah.
Maybe that would actually be an interesting interpretation of it, right? Yeah, it still leaves me wondering what exactly it means, but
yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
So I just thought it's an interesting thought.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to do the interview. It looks like we were talking about 40 minutes. So yeah, it's, yeah.
Okay. Well, my pleasure, and good luck to the Daily Ant.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll let you know when this goes up. I think it'll be Friday. I'm not sure if I'll be able to post the whole video because I don't know if it'll be too much data or something. But I hope I can post the whole thing because it's pretty interesting. I've been wanting to actually ask the ants rationality question to somebody, so it's nice to ask an expert.
Okay. Well, good talking to you.
Thank you very much. And see you later.